everyone. My name is Daniel, and this is my partner Laura. We're going to talk to you guys today about stimulants and how they affect your brain. So, can anyone name any examples for me of stimulants that they might have heard of before?
Caffeine.
There's one.
Cocaine.
Another one.
Meth.
Yep. Okay, so we covered a lot of the ones I'm going to show you here, but probably one of the most widely used stimulants in the world is actually nicotine, found in cigarettes. Another one that's keeping a lot of you awake right now is probably caffeine, found in all of these wonderful energy drinks, as well as coffee and tea. We already mentioned methamphetamine, made famous by Breaking Bad, but it's certainly been around a lot longer than that. And of course, as someone else mentioned, cocaine. Those aren't the only stimulants that we're going to talk about today, but those are the most commonly known ones. So I'm going to point out right now that most of what we're going to talk to you guys about today does not actually apply to caffeine and nicotine. Those are kind of unique. Their effects in the brain are kind of different, and they're a lot less potent in one sense. So while we consider them to be stimulants, what we're going to talk about for the rest of this presentation doesn't apply to them for the most part. So I'm going to use an animation here to help me explain how stimulants actually work in your brain. Now you'll recall that we talked to you about. That we talked about the idea that synapses are where neurotransmitters are released from one cell to another, right? In this case, we're showing an example of dopamine. However, when the signal is done, you need to get rid of it. And the way this is done with dopamine, at least, is with these things called transporters, which suck the neurotransmitter back up into the cell when it's done with it. And this is where drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine have their effect. So as you're going to see here, when cocaine is in the synapse, it blocks these transporters and does not allow the neurotransmitter to go back in. So it sits around in the synapse and it builds up and it stays there for a lot longer. When meth goes in, it actually makes the transporter run backwards, as you can see. And so in both cases, these drugs lead to a large increase in this neurotransmitter in terms of how long it's there and how much of it's there. So I've been talking about neurotransmitters. Which ones are actually affected by this? So we already talked about dopamine in the introduction. It's the neurotransmitter associated with reward. We also talked about serotonin. It's the neurotransmitter associated with mood. Now the third one that's a bit unique to stimulants is adrenaline, which we sometimes call norepinephrine. This is what's kind of associated with the response that you kind of feel if you're about to get into a fight or you're about to run away, right? You're trying to run away from something. Your heart starts beating faster. You can feel the blood rushing to your skin. Your temperature goes up. Sometimes you might think of this as an adrenaline rush. All of these are affected and are increased by using stimulants. Now, because of the role of the effect of these neurotransmitters, we can kind of think about what physical effects these stimulants would have. So one effect is that your heart rate goes up a lot, and that increases your risk of having a heart attack. Another problem you have is that your blood pressure goes up, so now you have a risk of having a stroke. Your temperature can also increase, and this is especially a problem if you're at a Coachella or a rave here, right? And you take these drugs so you can party all night. If you get too hot, you're going to get very dehydrated, and that can have very dangerous effects on the body. It also decreases your appetite, which can lead to weight loss. And finally, it can lead to this disgusting, awful thing in the case of meth called meth mouth. And this is partly because you have less saliva produced in your mouth. It's also because meth addicts don't really care about their teeth. And so that kind of brings me to the subject of the mental effects, right? So stimulants cause you to be obsessively focused on certain things. And this is why you see in many cases these meth addicts in particular have these sores on their skin because they sit there and pick at their skin for hours. So they sometimes call this tweaking. They also increase your alertness, so you're more awake, you're paying more attention to things. But that can be pretty bad, because if you're paying attention to the wrong things, you can go totally crazy. You can be convinced, as one man in Florida was, that you're being chased by a pack of German shepherds. We can call that paranoia. You can also just exhibit bizarre, aggressive behavior that we sometimes call psychosis. And so, as if stimulants don't have enough problems on their own, when you mix them with certain other drugs, they become even more dangerous. So mixing two stimulants together is obviously a bad idea because it'll just have more of an effect. But mixing stimulants with drugs that have opposite effects is in some ways even a worse idea. So when I say opposite effects, I mean that instead of increasing your breathing, for example, they decrease it. And you may hear today about some of these other drugs and other talks. Drugs like alcohol, sleeping pills, and anxiety medications, and heroin and other painkillers reduce a lot of physical things that stimulants actually increase, like breathing and heart rate. So the problem is that stimulants now are kind of masking the effects of this other drug for a little while. You don't feel as drunk, for example, but when the stimulant wears off, the full effect of that other drug hits you. And so it's a very, very dangerous combination. And Philip Seymour Hoffman is an example of someone who unfortunately died by combining a stimulant with several opiates. How do people actually use these drugs? The most common ways are by snorting and smoking. Typically, people snort a lot of cocaine. They smoke crack or they smoke crystal meth. You can also eat many of these drugs, especially prescription drugs that we're going to talk about in a second. And most uncommonly, but it still happens, people do inject them. Now, we've already talked to you guys a little bit about the concept of addiction and withdrawal, and addiction is obviously a huge problem with stimulants. They're one of the most widely used addictive drugs. When you stop taking a stimulant after using it for a while, you start to have kind of the opposite effects that the stimulant has when you're on it. So instead of being very alert, you're very fatigued, you're very tired. Instead of having a reduced appetite, you have an increased appetite. And instead of being obsessively focused on things, you can't focus on anything at all. And so these can be very difficult, unpleasant things to experience, so that causes people to seek out more of the drug, and so it perpetuates this cycle of using and then withdrawing. And once you're trying to get more and more of this drug, eventually you're going to need to pay for it. And often people have to resort to a lot of very bad things to do that. They might go around and steal things to pay for their drug habit. They might go into prostitution to pay for it. And of course, with all this money that's being spent on these drugs, that's a huge part of what finances all the drug cartels. And you only need to go a few hours south of here to see examples of how that screws up a lot of places. So now I'm going to talk to you guys about a class of drugs that you've possibly heard of, but weren't aware were stimulants, and those are bath salts. So how many of you have actually heard of bath salts before? Okay, so some of you, good. For those of you who haven't, bath salts are essentially drugs that are being sold as legal highs online and in certain stores. They're not always called bath salts. Sometimes they've been called plant food, jewelry cleaner, phone cleaner. All of these names are designed to be deceptive, to cover up the fact that what's actually being sold is a drug. And I also want to point out that the bath salts are a real thing to make your tub smell nice, and real bath salts are not a drug. Do not try to go and use them. There are a lot of different names for bath salts. I'm not going to read all these to you, but the thing I want to point out here is that unlike many other drugs, these are not all names for the same drug. These are mostly names for different drugs. There are actually hundreds of different drugs that can be considered bath salts. And this is a huge problem, as I'll explain in a minute. What they all have in common, however, is that they have the same effect on your synapses as methamphetamine and cocaine, which I showed you a little bit earlier. They increase those neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. The physical and mental effects as a result of this are also very similar. The increased breathing, the increased heart rate, the increased blood pressure, the paranoia, the psychosis, all of these effects have been seen in people who use bath salts, just like they're seen with methamphetamine and cocaine. And most concerningly, they're just as, if not more addictive, as methamphetamine and cocaine. So they're just as bad as these drugs. What makes them worse, though, is the kind of complex safety and legal situation. So I put a question mark after the word legal at the beginning of this talk because some bath salts have now been banned. The most popular ones are illegal. But as I said, there are hundreds of them. And so the people that make bath salts are constantly switching up the formula to get around these bans. And so as a result, there are going to be legal bath salts around for a long time. Now, one of the issues with this is that if the drug is legal, it's not subject to any regulation. So it can be impure. Oftentimes a bath salt is actually a mixture of multiple drugs. Great. It's awake, it's just being stupid. It's oftentimes sold as a mixture of multiple drugs. And that's and so you have no idea what you're getting, and the people selling it typically don't know what's in it either. Another legal issue is that you will not be able to beat a drug test by using bath salts. Many of them do show up as methamphetamine. And the last kind of overall point of this is that these drugs have not been tested in humans, really. So you don't really know what the effects could be. And essentially, if you take these, it's sort of like somebody's guinea pig, except you're not getting paid to do it. You're just experimenting with these drugs, and it's not something that any of us should want to do. So now we're going to talk to you guys about ADHD medications. So before we talk about the medications, we have to explain what ADHD actually is. ADHD is a disorder that's characterized by people who have difficulty paying attention, and kind of hyperactivity, people just doing too much fidgeting and stuff, and a lot of impulsive behaviors, people doing things at inappropriate times. About 5% of children under 18 had ADHD worldwide, so it's a very prevalent disease. And in fact, some of you in this room are probably on medications for it right now. There are actually multiple different types of ADHD drugs. The most common ones are Adderall, Vyvanse, and Ritalin. Right now, Vyvanse is becoming the most common. largely because it's a bit harder to abuse. You can't snort it the way people snort Adderall and Ritalin. It also lasts a lot longer. But the most important point I want to make here is that there are many different doses of each of these drugs, and so you don't know when you buy ADHD meds from somebody which drug they have or how strong it is. So that's a huge risk that comes with people abusing this outside of what your doctor has given it to you for. If you're using it as directed by your doctor, they've picked out the right drug and the right dose for you, and it's usually fun. It's a problem though when you go kind of away from that. Now, why do people abuse ADHD medications? Typically, it's abused as what we consider to be a study. They think it's going to help them focus for longer when they need to study, it'll help them stay up very late, or it might even help them focus during the test. And so people, as a result, think it makes you smarter. Well, the truth of the matter is that it's the total opposite. It doesn't do that at all. While it does cause you to focus, first of all, you can end up focusing on the wrong thing. So instead of focusing on studying, you focus on online shopping. We're getting to the highest level you can get in Candy Crush. That's not what people want to do with this, but it frequently tends to happen. So it can actually end up being quite detrimental. And the dangers of the abuse then are quite extensive. So the biggest problem is that if you use this drug to help you study a couple of times, you start to become dependent on it. Now you can't focus when you don't have the drug, so you need it every time you need to study. And that can be a huge problem for students. It also messes up your sleeping patterns because typically it forces you to stay awake for a long time. And so then many people actually resort to using drugs like Xanax or other sleeping pills to help them sleep. And those drugs have their own set of issues, and they are also addictive. That constitutes an example of a dangerous combination that we talked about earlier. And of course, you can also fail a drug test if you're using these. And if you are prescribed these drugs, you should make sure that you let people know that you have a prescription for them because they can't show up in drug tests. If you're abusing them, you can get in a lot of trouble if you test positive for it. It is illegal to resell these drugs if you've been prescribed them or to acquire them if you haven't been prescribed them. So that's a big issue, and they're just as tightly regulated as drugs like methamphetamine and cocaine. And while it's rare, if you take enough of these drugs, you can die from them. And so with that concludes my talk. So what I was going to do